As the state's leading property and casualty insurance trade association, the Wisconsin Insurance Alliance plays a crucial role in safeguarding Wisconsinites. Alliance members provide vital insurance coverage, ensuring financial protection for individuals, businesses, and communities across the state. In times of need, they act as a reliable resource, helping residents recover from unforeseen events. Ultimately, the Wisconsin Insurance Alliance and its members contribute to the resilience and well-being of Wisconsin families and businesses by offering essential protection and support. WisI video of the WisPolitics Madison Luncheon Series at the Madison Club is made possible with sponsorship support from the Wisconsin Insurance Alliance.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the WisPolitics Luncheon for June 11, 2024. And I want to thank our sponsors right off the bat. Hush Blackwell Strategies. They've been with us from the beginning under a few different names, but thank you very much, Nathan and company. American Family Insurance, Excel Energy, Walmart, AARP Wisconsin, and Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield. And now that you wildly applaud. Okay, upcoming events at the Madison Club. Next week we have a new PSC chair, Summer Strand, on June 20. So please attend for that. A little break from politics, and we'll talk about the energy transition that's underway in Wisconsin and the rest of the world, I guess. And upcoming programs, the person who does that hasn't really cinched them up for August and September or October yet. So if you have any suggestions, you should see me. And then we're taking off July because we have some this RNC thing going on in Milwaukee. So we have an event going on there on July 16th, RNC week at Marquette University Law School. So anyway, too bad we don't have anything to talk about, huh? All right, so today, I originally was going to have a program to talk about the rhetoric coming out of the conventions, and that's the problem with early planning. So much then happened to throw off my plan that Barry and Susan and I decided we would change it up and talk about all the things that are going on and to try to either sort it out or confuse you more about what's at stake here. But anyway, I want to introduce Susan Yackee. And she is the director of the Follette School of Public Affairs, and go ahead, yeah, but I'm reading more, and a Collins-Bascom professor of public affairs at UW-Madison, and her research and teaching interests include the U.S. public policy making process, public management, regulation, health policy, and interest group politics. And then we have Barry Burden, and welcome, Barry. Please applaud. Barry's a professor of poli-sci at UW-Madison. He's also director of the Elections Research Center and a Lyons Family Chair in Electoral Politics. Now, I do have something unsettling about both of these people. Neither one has a degree from UW-Madison. So he's a Buckeye and she's a Tar Heel. So I don't think we're going to hold that against them, though, right? Right? Right, okay. We're still welcoming them.
Major public institutions,
yeah.
Right?
No, do you have to say the Ohio State University, though, all the time?
It's in my contract.
Okay. All right, well, let's start off with news of the day. So there's been a conviction in the Hunter Biden trial, a rapid conviction, and he's been found guilty of 3 felonies. Let's just sort that out, and we will get to other verdicts along the way. But, what does today's verdict mean for Wisconsin swing state voters, the true independent voter? Because I think that if you're a true partisan, you shrug these things off. But again, some people are affected by these news events. So why don't you start off, Barry?
The true independent voter, there are about 5 of them in Wisconsin. I think what it does mostly is takes the edge off the conviction of Trump a couple weeks ago. That appeared to move the polls just a little bit in Biden's direction, maybe a percentage point. That might have bounced back over time, but it was just, I think giving pause to some Trump supporters that this would be a reason they would back away. Very small effect. But I think now that you've got a conviction basically on the other side of the aisle, the both sides-ism kind of kicks in, and people who believe all politicians are corrupt can say, well, my side's not so bad, the other side's doing it as well. So I think it's sort of neutralizing that effect. It also keeps all of the Biden family troubles in the news for a while longer. There'll be another trial, I guess, in October over unpaid taxes and tax fraud in California. So Hunter Biden is not going away as an issue in this campaign.
It's sort of a weird issue, too, right? I mean, this is a gun charge on Hunter Biden's side, and, it makes for some strange bedfellows, where we have some Republicans calling this sort of like a bogus charge, Second Amendment ought not to be used. We ought to be protected against these kind of criminal charges. And so I think it plays an odd way, and it puts former President Trump in kind of an unusual position of, like, how hard are we going at Hunter Biden when this is a gun charge that he's been now convicted over. I mean, one thing I did see was President Biden saying he does not plan to pardon Hunter Biden. I think that a pardon could upset the apple cart in a really interesting fashion, but at this point he plans not to do so.
Okay, so we'll just stick with you, Susan. Barry said that this is kind of like a balancing thing for the Trump verdict and the sentencing to come. Do you see it that way also?
That's sort of interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm with Barry that a lot of the at least initial coverage coming out of the New York conviction has been of like that's like, it hasn't changed a lot of hearts and minds. Whereas, some of the other, potential trials that could have taken place at this point in the election season, but have not, maybe could have had a larger impact because they were more, front and center to the role of what it means to be a U.S. president.
Okay, so these mythical 5 voters that Barry talks about, okay, so, what is the trick? I mean, micro-targeting is being able to be utilized more than ever before. And so is there going to be one issue or thing that sort of tips the scale or sort of moves that undecided voter, or is it so individualized? They're going the campaigns and the parties are going to be trying, a plethora of issues to try to move these voters.
Let's see, a few things about that. I think mostly the campaigns are focused on turning out their supporters. It's easier to identify the people who are with you than the people who are unsure. And there's a gamble. If you try to mobilize independents, you might mobilize them for the other side. So I think with the two camps, as dug in as they are for Trump and Biden, mostly they will be focusing on finding their friends and getting them to the polls. Republicans have already changed their tune about early voting and absentee voting, as I think realizing that it's just about getting the numbers out. For the few independent voters that are out there, I don't think there is a single message. I think it varies. The number one issue people tell us concerns them right now is the economy. That has been the number one issue for several years since the pandemic, and inflation as kind of a subset of that. Yes, inflation has cooled. Wages are catching up or maybe passing the cost of doing business, but people still feel like prices are higher. It's expensive to rent an apartment or to buy a house or to buy a car or to buy groceries, and that's not going to stop before November. So I think that'll be an issue that Republicans certainly hammer, that Biden has been an incompetent president who has caused this to happen, whose spending choices and immigration policies and all kinds of other things have contributed to it. And Biden will probably try to combat that with actual economic statistics about job creation and the stock market. And so I think there won't be one issue, but for many independents, it'll be a sort of duel between different economic visions of what is happening, just different alternate realities about whether things are okay and on the mend, or whether we're actually in a recession, which is what many Americans believe in surveys, apparently.
Okay, Susan LaFollette's done some polling here in the past few years on issues, and I'm wondering how that informs you about what might happen in November.
Yeah, a couple of answers to that. Yeah, so we've partnered with the UW Survey Center to do some panel surveying of a group of 3,500 Wisconsinites. So folks all across the state asking kind of monthly check-ins with these individuals. And a couple of things we're learning. So of the independents in that group, Barry's absolutely right. Inflation and the economy are like top issues. Those are the issues that folks are saying are, quite a problem or an extremely big problem in that survey. For Republicans and for Democrats, they are issues that you'd kind of expect. Immigration runs really high on the Republican side of the aisle, whereas some of the other issues like health care, gun violence, climate are running higher for Dems. Going back to your question on independence, Jeff, I've been thinking a lot about the big issues that are going to drive turnout. Thinking about on the Dem side, abortion, undoubtedly, and on the Republican side, immigration, undoubtedly, right? And also how the other candidate is kind of trying to soften up their position a bit on those issues, right? With Trump saying on abortion, it's up to the states, right? So really kind of softening up that position from where he's been in the past. Whereas on immigration, just last week, President Biden issuing this major executive order, which, some people are going to argue is completely symbolic, and other people are going to say is going to have real policy consequences in terms of, essentially shutting down the border, right? So, that's even arguably more than softening up. So we see these big issues that are going to drive turnout. And one question for us, I think, is what does that do for independent voters? Is this softening up? Is it really going to be seen by independent voters as sort of a liability for the one candidate or a positive for the other?
Why don't we try to define some demographics associated with the true independent voter? I love this term that's been thrown around, the double hater. That's probably, you kind of are scolding me. You think I shouldn't use that so much because hate's a strong word. Is that it, Barry?
Yeah, it's not hate. It's dislike. It's a pretty grumpy electorate both candidates are facing. Voters are unhappy with the major party nominees. They're both disliked. Even members of their own parties wish that they were replaced with someone else, more so on the Democratic side, but still big numbers on both sides. So there are plenty of people who say they disapprove of both Biden and Trump. Trump has done pretty well with those kinds of voters in the past, people who are just down on politics, concerned about institutions, distrusting of authorities. That has been Trump's bread and butter in some ways. I'm not sure it still is, but they're a real concern, I think, for the Biden camp. So your question is about who are the independents? Yeah, they skew especially young. So it's young people who are least likely to have attachments to either of the parties, who are not fond of either of the candidates, and who have not bought into the traditional ways of doing politics. And that, I think, is a worrisome sign for Biden, because it is young voters that have been so crucial to the Obama victories and even to Clinton's performance in 2016 and to Biden's victory. So the kind of reluctance of young people to be with Biden as enthusiastically as they were in the past, I think, is a problem. The concern about what's happening in Gaza is part of that, but I think not a big part or not a majority part. It's really a kind of historic pattern that young people are just sort of open and unconnected and have not been socialized or deeply connected to a party. So Biden, I think, has room to grow in a way that Trump does not, but he has a lot of work in front of him to get those young people back.
So how do you define the Wisconsin independent, the true independent, or nationally? What are the demographics associated with those folks?
Yeah, I'm going to pile on with Barry on the young voters and think a little bit. He already raised Gaza, but let me talk about what I think is sort of the sleeper issue amongst young voters, and that's all things housing, right? So housing, and it ties in with the fact that inflation is oftentimes, including in our Wisconsin WisCsays poll, amongst young voters, inflation is the issue, the economy, they're big issues for young voters, and to me it ties all back to this sleeper issue of housing. Young folks not feeling like they can afford to buy a house,
So inflation's a proxy for I can't afford X or Y or Z,
I can't afford the American dream, right? And you're trying to sell that to young folks in America and sell your vision of tomorrow, and you can't afford the American dream anymore. You know, and it ties with inflation in the sense that, you know, why is housing so expensive right now? Well, it's partly because of the Federal Reserve and the need to keep interest rates high right now. And the unaffordability of housing is, you know, has all these ripple effects.
So I don't have the Dane County stat on top of my head. I just read this recently, though. The average home price in Waukesha County is $500,000. So, you know, and I don't know what it is in Dane County, but obviously it's high, and it's and interest rates are in the high single digits. So I think that there's obviously something to it. But I think the inflation, back to I think that the Biden camp is trying to truce squad some of this. Like, well, really the economy isn't that bad. Look at all these top line numbers, but people, I guess, aren't feeling it. I think that's what you were suggesting.
Yeah, I've never seen a mismatch like this between what people say in surveys they think about the economy and what the objective indicators report. And actually, it comes out in the surveys a little bit if you ask people about their own financial situation. It's pretty good. Or you ask them about their community, generally positive. But if you ask them how the economy is going nationally, it's very negative. Large numbers say we're in recession, things are going poorly. So how can everyone's personal economy be pretty good, and yet everyone also think the national economy is doing poorly? So there's definitely a communications challenge for the Biden team, I think, to sell the public on Bidenomics, on the infrastructure spending, on the CHIPS Act, on prescription drug renegotiation, student loan stuff to appeal to young people, the forgiveness plans. And he's got, I think, still time to do that because conventions haven't happened. We're not fully in a general election mode yet. But it's going to be some work. It won't be totally successful. There will still be Americans who are convinced things are not going well, and they will feel that genuinely because of the prices they're facing for housing and groceries and other kinds of things. But I do think it's back to my earlier point about the dueling economic messages. That's not going to be all the campaigns are about, but it will be a central point of contention between the two sides.
Okay, Susan, do you think this is going to be a low turnout election, or Barry talked about the grumpy electorate, and we have two very well-known candidates, but two very disliked candidates too. That seems to spell a low turnout election.
Most experts think we're going to have a lower turnout election than we did in 2020. Part of that is probably due to the fact that we had kind of almost universal mail-in ballot opportunities in 2020, and we're not going to have that here in 2024. So that's probably aligning with that as well.
So everything I read says that helps Biden, strangely enough. That flips the switch on the old, the Democrats like high turnout.
Yeah, I think we need to change our thinking on that. The conventional wisdom, probably still the dominant wisdom, is that higher turnout helps the Democrats, but it seems to have been reversed. Biden is doing better in polls that are of the most likely voters. But if you expand the universe a little bit to include people who are sometimes voters or are just registered voters but maybe haven't voted in a while, Trump begins to do better. So keeping the electorate a little smaller in terms of who participates might help the Democrats. That's been the pattern during these midterm and special elections since the last presidential. And I think that's why we're seeing some discrepancies in the polls, is we always have trouble figuring out what's the universe of people who will show up. I agree with Susan, it's going to be smaller than in 2020, but we don't know how much smaller, and we don't know which segments will be dropping out compared to 2020 versus maybe new groups that are showing up. So difficult task, but I think our conventional understanding about how turnout advantages one party or the other probably just works differently this time.
This is for both of you, or jump in as you like. But what do you tell people when say what should I, when the different polls are coming out, whatever? What do you tell people? Do you tell people ignore it until October? Do you tell people, depend upon this poll, don't depend upon that poll? What are you telling students or friends or family?
Well, you tell them different things when the polls are clear or when the polls are a complete toss-up, which is what they are right now. The polls are a complete toss-up. We are in the standard error right now, and any good political methodologist will tell you don't make predictions when you're sitting in the standard error. That's where we are nationally. That's where we are in the swing states as well. So new CBS poll just, I think this last week, put it completely at a coin flip, with a USA Today poll recent saying that only about 12% of the electorate are kind of somewhat undecided as to where they're at. So we have, you can't really discern anything from the poll other than a lot could happen between now and Election Day.
Can I say a few more things about that? We could spend the next hour on this. First, the timing of the polls. We're here in early June. Polls are not very predictive in early June. Conventions haven't happened. Running mates haven't been announced. Platforms haven't been released. We haven't had debates yet, though those are coming quickly. So the predictive ability of the polls tends to grow a lot after Labor Day. It's about that 90-day period where you start to get a closer connection. So that's one reason to take them with a grain of salt. The other is we have these third parties floating around and independent candidates like Robert Kennedy and Cornel West. In some surveys they're included, in some they're not. I think most of them are showing at higher levels than we actually expect them to get in November, so that's another source of things. My other advice to friends and family is check out who's doing the poll. There are some high-quality pollsters out there, and they come around every time. Our own Marquette poll is now recognized not just as a Wisconsin leader, kind of gold standard, but also at the national level. But there are also a lot of fly-by-night organizations that show up and do some quickie polls, and many of them have a kind of partisan axe to grind. If you remember the 2022 midterms, there was a lot of talk about the red wave that was going to take over those elections, and it never materialized. Part of the reason it didn't materialize is the wave was built, or the idea of the wave was built on a lot of polls that had sort of flooded the zone, coming from Republican-leaning pollsters that were more favorable to the GOP. So it just made things look like Republicans were going to do better than they were. We're not seeing that kind of flooding happening this time around, but it might be something that appears in the fall.
Right. There are always a lot of junk polls out there. So it pays to concentrate on the how the polls are rated and how the polls are done. This is a really a question I often hear from people, the poll watchers, and then we'll get into the conventions and the debate. So pollsters, because they're not reaching everybody, it's harder than ever to reach everybody. Now you're doing your methodology too, and I'll be interested to hear this. Is that so then pollsters adjust their results. They weight the results for people they're not picking up. They could be minority citizens. They could be the Trump voter, the non-college educated white rural voter. I think is sort of like some sort of archetype for pollsters. So what about that practice? And do you think it's overdone sometimes? Do you think it's the right thing to do? I mean, and then maybe you can, Susan, explain why you are doing the way you're doing it.
Yeah, so this is a boring answer, but we don't know which ways the polls will be biased in any given election cycle until the election happens. It's after the fact that we realize they had a slight tilt on one side or the other, and the tilt is not consistent. 538 has done some analysis of this. One cycle, the polls will be a little more favorable to Republicans. Other cycles to Democrats. It's not consistent even in the short run. Just in a 2-year period, we can see the polls skew one way or the other. Some of that is pollsters trying to fix the things that went wrong last time by making these adjustments for people who don't respond or difficult to get. But in doing that, we're probably ignoring some other new problem that has emerged in this round of polling. So the pollsters are always kind of chasing the difficulties, as they should be doing. But it means they're always behind also whatever the problem of that cycle is going to be. And we don't know this time around what that problem will be. So I think it's hard to say what the biases will be. We do know 538 today just released its forecast of the election, first forecast of the election. The forecast is based on the polls, of course, but also economic fundamentals, variables that political scientists know predict elections. The polls alone show Trump winning pretty handily. He's winning the popular vote nationally. He's winning in all the swing states. Looks like he would win the Electoral College pretty easily. But if you include the fundamentals, these are not poll-based, these are objective economic indicators, it's a tie race. So that, to me, says it looks like the polls are leaning a little bit on the Republican side. That might change, again, as conventions happen, as these third parties sort of become better known to the public. But the sad truth is we don't know until after the votes are cast.
Yeah, some of the need for weighting and not necessarily understanding how to do that weighting is one of the reasons why La Follette, and really in particular the UW Survey Center, has been working with this new poll. It's called Wisconsin Says. It's a panel of 3,500 Wisconsinites. And so they take the temperature of these same Wisconsinites every month on different topics, and as well as public policy topics. So this is a group that is about 42% Democrat, 41% Republican, and 17% independent. Representative panel. One of the things that we've been asking them regularly is about their public policy views. And so that helps to get around some of the weighting issues, so we can kind of set up the panel and then go back to these folks and see how they are changing across time, which is kind of a neat element of a panel study. And that's where we're trying to do some media at the La Follette School around public policy topics, where we're seeing either some consensus amongst those Republican and Democratic voters, as well as areas where there might be some divides and opportunities for the candidates.
So how are you surveying them? Is it on phone, via phone, or what?
This one's an online survey.
Okay.
La Follette has tested out, done a public policy poll in the past using UW Survey Center with a paper methodology too, so like going old school and sending paper and then follow-ups with online. So we've done it a couple different ways. And one of the reasons we chose in the past to do a paper survey was we could really target geographically where people were at. And as part of that effort, we wanted to make sure we had a really strong representative sample of rural Wisconsinites. But this current effort, this panel study, is all done online. And we're seeing kind of the same respondents come back month in and month out, which is a neat way to look at the Wisconsin electorate.
What if somebody doesn't have internet access or doesn't like to use the internet? Are they excluded from the panel?
They would have been invited to the panel, but if they do not use the internet, and this particular study wouldn't pick them up.
Okay, so let's talk about some big events that are coming up that may affect the polling, or may affect the race ultimately. So we have a Trump-Biden debate later this month, which is an unusual time to have a presidential debate. I don't think we've had a general election debate in the modern era, certainly before the conventions. And then we have the RNC in Milwaukee, and we have the DNC in Chicago, 90 miles apart. Again, it's a Midwest emphasis from both parties. And so I'm going to try to sort of like hone this in on Wisconsin and the Midwest. How do you think those events, and if I were a pollster, I'd be thinking I'm going to poll after the DNC, after everything is maybe baked in, right, or after a couple weeks after the DNC or something, to see what is baked in. But I don't know. Tell me, how do you think this is going to affect what's going on?
I don't know. The debate, as you said, is strange, not just because of the timing. It's in June, before we have nominees officially, before they're running mates and all of that business, but also the rules. There will be no audience. There will be strict time limits where the speakers will be cut off if they exceed. This was something Biden had proposed to the Trump campaign on social media, and Trump accepted on social media within hours. I think Biden got the upper hand in the design, in the format. Trump likes an audience. He likes the back and forth. He likes, combative conversation with the moderators, and he won't be able to go on at length, and he won't have an audience to cheer on what he's saying. But the timing is so strange. I think very few people are likely to watch it who are not already pretty invested and have a side. Unless something comes from the debate that becomes a kind of viral moment or something that can be used in campaign advertising or fundraising, I don't think the debate itself has a lot of effect. For example, if there were something that kind of fed into concerns about Biden's age and his mental capacity, if he were to stumble in speaking or not be able to respond, there would be a clip for sure from the Trump campaign, and that would be used either by him or by the super PAC against Biden. If Trump says something outrageous that's different from other outrageous things he said, that might be an ad as well. But otherwise, I think the debate is just kind of be in this sterile vacuum that not many people are tuned into. And that's definitely true, and I don't think there's anything special in Wisconsin that will cause people to tune into that. The convention itself, first ever convention in the state of Wisconsin, and I was just looking back to see what political science research had been done on the effects of where conventions are located. And there were a couple of effects that had been identified. One is there's no effect on turnout. Turnout does not go up in the state that hosts the convention. And there's only really a small effect in favor of the party that's holding the convention, probably not enough to change things. Though if we're a 20,000 vote margin again, maybe that's enough. But the main effect seems to be that it makes Democrats in surrounding counties more Democratic. So it boosts the Democratic vote in those places and makes Republicans in surrounding counties more Republican. So it sort of polarizes the local electorate, I think, by just putting more attention on the campaign and having them kind of elaborate and think about it a bit. So if anything, having the RNC here might exacerbate the relatively high-level polarization that already exists in Wisconsin, more so than other states.
That news is met with like, did you hear the response from the audience?
Oh, groan.
Really? Whoa.
I guess when I'm looking ahead at the conventions, I'm sort of seeing two big things. And one, when we think about the RNC, Trump, former President Trump just told Dr. Phil, that he was planning to announce his VP at the RNC, right? So, I think they sort of hinted at that in the past, but has now confirmed that that's an announcement that's going to be made at the RNC. That's kind of going to be big news this year. I know in the past, Trump has really taken up all the oxygen in the room, but with the potential criminal indictments, the different possibilities for President Trump, the VP could hold for some voters, might be more meaningful for the President Trump's VP choice. Setting even aside the fact that we know that President Trump would not be, if elected, would not be able to run again, right? So setting up his VP to be, the Republican, potential candidate, the keeper of the Trump movement going forward. And we're seeing, Fox News is reporting that really three candidates are getting the formal vetting from the Trump team. That's Marco Rubio, Vance, and Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota. Surprisingly, Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota. I'm from North Dakota, if you have any Doug Burgum questions. There's some other candidates that are on the short list, too. Tim Scott is one of them. But, I do think that that's coming out of the RNC. It's something I'm watching really carefully. And, I know that some folks feel like Marco Rubio, other than the fact that he's also registered in Florida, and the Constitution will not allow us to have a presidential and vice presidential candidate from the same state. One of them would need to move. But other than that kind of detail, which could be ameliorated, I think Marco Rubio and the idea of the Hispanic vote is really, really interesting for President Trump. Okay, so let's go with that a little bit, because, the messaging out of the convention is the thing that polarizes people,
is intense, right? I mean, each party is going to try to be sending a message. So what do you anticipate some of the messages that might be coming out from the two parties that might affect, the Wisconsin electorate?
Yeah, so coming out of the election, I think Republicans are going to be hammering really hard on wanting to turn out older voters. And so what do we know about older voters and some of their public policy issues right now? Crime and immigration are at the top of the list. I think there's going to be, at least at the RNC, a lot of display of reaching out to, untraditional Republican voters, at least untraditional Republican voters in the past. So a big reach out for black voters, Hispanic voters, in a way that we might not have seen in the past. And, maybe we can just hold on the RNC and let Barry talk, because I think the DNC is going to be a very different animal.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. What issues get emphasized, or what are the messages coming out of the campaigns at the convention from the nightly speeches and then the messaging and the ads afterwards? I think for Republicans, probably chaos at the border is very close to the top. Inflation and chaos at the border, and those things are linked to them. They're also linked to crime, which the public is saying they have concerns about. opioids and fentanyl and all of those problems are also linked. In their minds, election integrity and voting by non-citizens has become a new concern for Republicans. So there's sort of this bundle of things that are all tied to what's happening in Texas and Arizona, I think, that will be a big part of the convention night. It was a big part of Trump's 2 prior campaigns and has not gone anywhere. The Biden campaign, I think, has a counter to that, which is, hey, I tried to do serious immigration reform. I issued an executive order. There was a bipartisan bill in the Senate, and you guys sunk it. So there's sort of, I'm an old guy, but I'm also the adult in the room. And Trump will say, but you're the problem in Washington, and you haven't fixed things. And so I think border stuff will be very high. Susan mentioned abortion as an issue for the Democrats. That's definitely going to be one of their messages. But it, too, I think, has some other things attached to it. It's now become connected to contraception access, to IVF, to other methods of abortion, the medication by mail and those kinds of things which are being regulated or talked about. Even coverage through the ACA, which is now a really popular law. It's become more popular over time, and I think the Biden campaign is just now coming back to health care and its advantages and trying to use that. So there are these kind of buckets of things, I think, that are connected that are going to be really central themes that are not one issue, but a bunch of things that hopefully tell voters, this is a team that is aware of all these connections and will address them convincingly.
Barry started in on the D side of the aisle, and I mean, we're going to have a really interesting convention in Chicago. I mean, there are going to be significant protests in Chicago, and there are going to be a diverse coalition of folks talking about foreign policy, and in particular the Israeli-Gaza conflict. And that is going to affect the DNC in a way and really bring back a lot of memories of past DNC conventions in Chicago in a way I just don't think we can fully anticipate. And the fact that that's going to bring the Dems and President Biden off message, they might be wanting to talk about abortion and health care and access to contraception, but they're going to be talking a lot about Israel and Gaza.
Okay, so the glimpse of that was at the State Democratic Party convention just past weekend in Milwaukee, where there was a protest during Senator Baldwin's speech, and then there was a controversy over a couple of resolutions that passed on this issue. So both parties, there's still primaries going on. So, but we have our virtual nominees. So we have, on the Biden side, the weakness is on the folks who are organizing, an uninstructed vote or a non-vote for Biden as a demonstration. And then on the Republican side, you still have people voting for Nikki Haley. So it's sort of like, okay, so neither candidate, again, the candidates that are so well known and so disliked, has united their own parties, that's part of what conventions are supposed to do. But I'm wondering whether you think these conventions are actually going to achieve that for either party.
Yeah, it's a problem for both sides, though I think the problem is a little different for the Dems than for the Republicans. For the Dems, they certainly have this group of especially young voters concerned about what's happening in Gaza. But where do those voters go if they decide they can't stomach voting for Biden? Not to Trump, who's even more favorable to Israel than the Biden administration, I think. They might hop to a third-party candidate, to a Jill Stein or probably not Robert Kennedy, but maybe one of the others, Cornel West. So if Biden were to lose them, that's a loss of one vote, essentially, for each of them. But for the Nikki Haley supporters on the Republican side, if they can't stomach voting for Trump in the fall, especially because of the recent conviction, the place they're likely to go, I think, is to Biden, at least some of them. So that's a more serious problem because now it's a loss of a vote for Trump, but it's also a gain of a vote for Biden. So it's actually a 2-vote swing. So the magnitude of those two protest votes in the primaries has been about the same. It's 10 or 15% in each state. But I think the consequences are a little greater for Trump than for Biden. We'll have to see what happens with Kennedy and West and Stein. But if they sort of fizzle out, as usually happens, I think the Gaza protest is a huge PR problem for the Democrats in Chicago. It's probably not a huge problem for them in terms of votes in November. It's very low on the list of issues. If you ask people in surveys, what are the top issues motivating you? Gaza is single digits. It's very small. It matters a lot to a small subset of the electorate, but for most of the electorate, they actually don't have much of a position or are vaguely supportive of what Biden has been doing. There will be protests at the RNC for sure, but everywhere Trump goes, there are protests. That's just part of covering a Trump rally. Is there's a protest outside, and he sort of likes that. It's just part of his brand. That's not part of Biden's brand. He has not been to college campuses. He has not put himself in environments where that can happen, and there's likely to be large-scale organized efforts to embarrass or put the party on the record in Chicago. And that'll be, unfortunately for the Dems, I think, part of the media coverage of that event.
I'll just add one thing to that, and this is the right crowd because this is like the inside baseball crowd of politics. I mean, I'm also looking to both of these conventions to see who's on deck. Right? These are two very old leaders. Right? Who's on deck to be the next leader in the Democratic Party? Who's on deck to be the next leader in the Republican Party? And this
obviously, it's Doug Burgum, isn't it?
Well, I mean, let's go North Dakota. Who's on deck? These are traditionally places where candidates, new candidates like Barack Obama, exactly, were able to rise above and really get some additional media coverage. And we are at a place in our country where it's not clear who is going to be the leaders of our political parties going forward. And so I'm watching inside baseball who is on deck at these conventions. Okay,
so we haven't talked about the U.S. Senate races, which are crucial for who controls the U.S. Senate, narrowly controlled by Democrats now. So the race here is Baldwin versus Hovde will be winning the Republican primary. But, the New York Times battleground polls pointed this out, that the Democratic Senate candidates were all running ahead of Biden. What does that tell you?
I think part of that is that the Democrats are mostly incumbents. Tammy Baldwin, John Tester, others in these battleground Senate races are just better known to voters. I mean, that's certainly true in the Marquette polls here. But most people say they don't know who Eric Hovde is yet. So I think it makes a lot of sense that incumbents would fare well. And, congressional incumbents tend to win re-election. That discrepancy might continue to hold into November, but it's not going to be anywhere as big as it is today. So I think there'll be some closing of those gaps as the Republican challengers in these Senate races become better known.
Yeah, I'll just add to that at least 538 and some of the other polling sites are showing it's going to be it's a slightly better year in both the Senate and the House for the Republican side of the aisle. So if Trump outperforms, we could very well see a unified Republican government going into 2024, right? So that's certainly a situation we have.
That would carry over definitely into House races.
Yep, absolutely, right. And that would be a big change of turn from where we're at right now with divided government.
Okay, so questions from the audience now. Raise your hand, and then I'll call on you. Jimmy, you might want to ask a question since you're seated all the way in the back. That's my gift to you today. Okay, Jimmy's passing. This is an unusual event. No, okay. Questions from folks? Go ahead, right here. Everybody hear that? He's asking about some of the climate-related bills that have passed and what the impact of that might be on the election and the electorate.
I'm going to start by saying I need to connect you with my colleague, Professor Manny Teodoro at the Follette School, who has a new water report card out on Wisconsin. Really interesting research on thinking about water across our state, and he's one of the leading water scholars in the country. So if you don't know him, I want to connect you. You're right, though. It hasn't, climate change, environment, they have not so far been huge issues in this election. And despite the fact that President Biden has, arguably passed the largest climate bill during his time in office, it hasn't broken through. Although you do see, especially among young voters, climate change still being one of the top issues that they list, but including here in Wisconsin as being one of their top priorities. And so if we think about kind of, as Barry was saying, kind of, for lack of better words, kind of bringing young voters back into the fold, climate change, the environment, and Biden's long commitment to it, I think, is a path toward re-engaging some of those voters.
Yeah, I think that sounds exactly right, and that's a way to kind of soften the Gaza problem also, is to remind young voters, for the Biden campaign, to remind young voters, hey, there are these other things we've done that we agree on. Let's talk about that and how much better we would be than the other side. I don't know about water. I don't think that's going to be much of an issue for voters, but climate change, I would say, is kind of a mid-tier issue and probably higher than that for Democrats. And here's one of the branding problems for Biden. The Inflation Reduction Act is where most of that Green New Deal stuff was tucked away. It's doing all kinds of things that he'll be bragging about. But the name of the bill focuses on inflation, and the public thinks inflation is still a very serious problem. So they're going to say, look, you passed this bill that was targeting inflation, and it didn't solve the problem. And the other stuff is kind of invisible to us. So again, there's a communications challenge or opportunity for the Biden-Harris team, I think, to say, hey, look at what we've done, accomplishments that are already in place and things that are coming. And forget the name of the bill. Here's a list of concrete things that are beneficial. Whether they can get that out in a noisy news environment when there are other things happening, I don't know. But that's the way I think to elevate those issues for them.
Right. The other issue with that is that it takes a while for these things to happen, for the money to get out there, for the actions of the big elements of the bill to actually occur and result in change. So that is an issue. I do think safe drinking water. I don't know what maybe you used that phrase, but I think safe drinking water is an issue definitely in Wisconsin. I mean, we see that it's a bipartisan issue, and I do think that that's like a window into some of these other issues, right? Sometimes I see that being done, but that's definitely a bipartisan issue here in Wisconsin. The speaker had a task force on it, and they made a point of passing some measures about it. And then you have the whole PFAS thing, which is again, they're fighting over money, but it's still a bipartisan issue.
I do think it'll come up in the Senate race. I mean, Tammy Baldwin has been focused on those kinds of bread and butter issues, ground well contamination, PFAS problems, and so she's got legislation to tackle those things, and we'll just be talking about it on the trail. I think that's going to be more prominent than in the presidential race for sure.
Yeah, and also in the first and the eighth CDs where they didn't have much competition last time around.
Yeah, well, anytime you're getting higher turnout at the bottom of the ticket, you're going to help the top of the ticket. I mean, it's usually going to be the other way around, right? But I have heard some coverage recently, talking about how, this kind of weird inversion where, in some cases, Senate candidates are doing better than President Biden. Getting folks out for Senate races or more local races actually might be the way in which puts President Biden over the top in some states. And so, but that is like an inversion on the way we normally think about it.
Yeah, in most years, I would say kind of reverse coattails like this just are not going to happen. It's impossible to have a state legislative race affect a presidential race. But I think there's a little opportunity for that here just because those major party candidates, Biden and Trump, are so disliked. The public is saying they're ready for that campaign to be over. They're going to vote reluctantly, not enthusiastically. And so if something else can motivate them to take part, it will have some benefits up the ticket.
Yeah, they just have to remind everybody, go vote for Biden while you're there somehow. It's a weird thing. It's usually you're voting for president now, go remember the state rep you're voting for.
Well, and that's going to be in spades in some of the states that have the referendum votes on abortion, right? So that's really where there's the hope, I think, on that kind of reverse ticket.
Right, but even if we don't have a referendum here, abortion is on the ballot. I mean, we saw that in 2022. I mean, I mean, is it more of an issue or less of an issue than it was in 2022? Do you have any sense?
Well, I think the way Susan does about this, in a few states, progressives have put abortion on the ballot as a standalone issue, in Arizona and Florida, I think. And there will be single-issue voters who are concerned about that, who maybe aren't so knowledgeable about the candidates or enthusiastic about them, but while they're there voting on the abortion measure, are likely to cast ballots for Democrats more than Republicans. So those issues are tucked at the bottom of the ballot, so that could be a kind of up-ballot effect also.
Right. Okay.
That's a tough one. Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. So for those of you who didn't see the news, there's been some, some coverage, and then I saw it in the New York Times this morning about both Alito and Justice Roberts giving some kind of off-the-cuff remarks. In particular, Alito, captured again in kind of another, somewhat controversial statements about the kind of the role of the courts in society. So it's undoubtedly true that we have a lot of issues that are going to be decided by the courts that we could have both presidential candidates pounce on. I'll mention one here that maybe your mind doesn't go to immediately, and that's the administrative state. So there's going to be a huge, huge consequential court ruling, very likely against the administrative state being issued by the Supreme Court over the next month. It has to do with the deference that courts have to provide to administrative agencies when they write regulations. Now that sounds really boring, but what that means in translation is the ability for the executive branch to write legally binding regulations and have them upheld by the courts. And it's very likely that some of the deference toward administrative agencies is going to reduce. This is a pet issue of the Republican side of the aisle, in particular, folks in like the Federalist Society kind of wing of the party. But it also corresponds with President Trump's messaging on kind of the power of the deep state. I could see that being leveraged, for instance, as a win on the Republican side of the aisle.
That's the Chevron case, right?
That's
if
the
you want
Chevron
to
case.
Google the Chevron case. Do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think the court will come up in a couple other ways in the campaign. One is that Trump will remind his supporters that he appointed 3 justices who helped overturn Roe v. Wade. And if he doesn't remind them, Biden will remind them he was responsible for the overturn of Roe v. Wade. So it comes up there. But for Trump, that's a connection to the conservative Christian wing of the Republican Party. He selected Pence as his running mate in 2016, partly to reach out to that element within the party. And now Pence is gone, and I think he's kind of shored up that support. But the appointment of judges and justices has been really important for him to hold that group. And I think for Biden on the other side, the argument will be, look, this court has been stacked in a conservative direction. It's going to be that way for a while. You need me in the White House and Democrats in the Senate to protect abortion rights and other things. The Trump immunity case will come down at some point. The Senate is the place where his nominees are being approved. And so I think for both of them, this is not an issue that gets asked about in surveys. It's not going to be ranked highly, but I think it will be part of the messaging for sure.
Were we young? Oh, okay. Hard to remember.
It was hard to get a $20,000 a year job, and interest rates are 17%.
Right.
So this is a matter of a misguided perspective in some ways, and what the reality is. Salaries are up. People getting out of school are making way more money than any generation before that, and yet they have to pay more, and they still have to pass on down. So I was wondering, in that group, are you seeing any movement in people with respect
I'll start, and then I'll hand it over to Barry. When you look at looking back at this panel study of 3,500 Wisconsinites, and you break some of the top issues out by age, which is what we did. So breaking out folks kind of, let's go young, middle, old. Like, I don't know, I think I'd probably fit in the old at this point, but young, middle, old. And where are people at? Healthcare is really similar. High, important problem across all those age groups. Inflation, much higher amongst young people. So they're really concerned about inflation. Economy, another issue. Young people very concerned about climate change. Environment, another issue. In contrast, kind of crime, gun violence, older people are really, really interested in that issue. Those two particular issues as part of the Wisconsin's panel. And those are some of the big breakdowns we saw by age.
So young people are really down on the economy. They're down on the way the economy works. They're down on capitalism as an idea. I mean, there are surveys asking people whether you have more favorable views of socialism or capitalism, and young people are now up for grabs on which of those is a better plan. What they mean by those terms, I think, we don't know, but there's just a concern about the things we mentioned: student loan debt, housing costs, whether it's a mortgage or rent, healthcare, groceries, just big expenses have become serious, and wages have not kept up. I think this is more of a serious problem for Biden when it comes to young people of color, and those, diversity and age are related because young populations are more racially diverse. Especially young men of color are not enthusiastic about Biden. Remember, this group that will be 18 and eligible to vote for the first time doesn't remember Barack Obama. They were 10 years old or 11 years old when that guy left office. So their life, when they've been aware of politics at least, has been the Trump era and the 3 or 4 years of Biden. So they're pretty disenchanted, I think, looking for other things and have some fond memories or beliefs about what Trump did when he was in office. And so you're seeing less support from the minority community, especially among young Black and Hispanic voters for Biden. And he's going to have to win them back, I think, to be competitive in the swing states. I think it's both. I think young people are down on the economy as a thing, the way it operates, and whether this is the right system for our country, and also what the statistics and the experiences are right now.
Okay, go ahead. Well, just 2 more questions. We're going to run a little bit over time because we have we have an enthusiastic audience. This is good. Go ahead. Why would you subject yourself to that? Just kidding.
Well, you're not seeing COVID dominate the polls. We'll say that to start off with. But, I don't think we can underestimate how COVID has affected society, right? So and let's talk about it on both ends of the spectrum, right? So we have far fewer people with us after COVID, right? And on the elderly end of the spectrum, we've lost Americans, right? And I think there's a lot of families that are still grieving there. And on the younger end of the spectrum, we lost a lot of time spent socializing. We have an anxiety decade of students. We have students who are coming to college that are differently prepared than they used to be. And that is probably affecting some of their attitudes toward government, toward the government's ability to get things done, toward the ability of capitalism to even be the right path forward. And so I think that's the way I think about COVID's impact. It's also true that from 1964 to to 2021, trust in government dropped from 77% to 24%. Right? So those are also true statistics. Mm-hmm.
I think there is a lot of rethinking now about how we handled COVID. Some people thinking we didn't go far enough with public health measures, masking and vaccinations, and others feeling like we went too far in shutting down schools and churches and other institutions. I think that feeds into Trump's favor because it's a kind of distrust of authorities, that Anthony Fauci, the CDC, and whomever, public health doctors, didn't know what they were doing. And we don't know what the source of the initial infection was in China, for example. So my guess is that works into many of Trump's rallies, where he's sort of riffing on issues, that this one is one of the ones he touches on along the way. Biden is likely to talk about the Build Back Better program and getting us out of COVID. There's going to be a lot of selective remembering about what happened in 2020 and who was president and when did all that occur and those kinds of things. So I agree with you. It's a kind of undercurrent that doesn't get talked about directly but does feed into these other kinds of ideas.
Maybe that's why we're grumpy. Okay, Ron, last question. Okay. All right, Chris, you get the last question. Make it a good one, Chris. Well, wait a minute. It's only June. Thank you for yielding the floor, Ron. What about the
pattern of women
voting?
So surveys show women are more concerned about the abortion issue than men are. Their opinions on abortion are actually not very different. Men and women are pretty similar in their views about what abortion policy should be, but it's more of an animating issue for women voters than for men voters, and that has helped Democrats through these midterm special elections, primaries, and other things that have happened since the Dobbs decision came down. So I think that's a source of fuel on the Democratic side, that there are women, including women who might have voted for Trump in the past or been Republican-friendly, who are now concerned enough about abortion and the other connected issues of contraception and so on that they're likely to lean in Biden's direction this time. It's been surprising to me that the gender gap has not grown during the Trump era. It wasn't really bigger in 2016, even though there was a woman on the ticket for the Democrats and Trump, who had this kind of macho, way of presenting himself, to say the least, on the Republican side, and it's been there. That the gender gap has sort of been at that level since then. The one place it's bigger is among African Americans and Hispanics. The gender gap is much bigger in those groups than it is among whites, and that's part of what I was saying earlier about sort of young men of color souring on Biden and Democrats to some degree. That has not happened for young women of color in the same way, and I think abortion is only part of that story.
I think I'll answer both your questions. So both the October surprise and women. So just to reiterate what Barry said, some of those issues that women are saying are more important than men. Well, first of all, I'll say in the Wisconsin poll, women are just more concerned about everything than men. Actually, that's higher. There's higher level of concern across all of the policy topics, which is kind of interesting. But inflation, stood out, and as well as gun violence, where there were real discrepancies between men and women. But I'm going to answer your October surprise in a way that, because I think I'm maybe the last speaker. One October surprise this year is going to be Follette's going to be getting out into 6 different communities across Wisconsin, talking about the public policy issues of our times. We're going to bring together groups of Wisconsinites around a table with a facilitator, so Dems, Republicans, Independents, to talk about the public policy issues in advance of the election. We're going to be everywhere from La Crosse, Milwaukee, Green Bay, Eau Claire, Madison, Milwaukee. We're really excited about that, and I hope that that's one way that we can help all of Wisconsinites kind of deliberate in a real civil way and speak to each other across difference in advance of our 2024 election.
All right, well, then that's a perfect way to end. Let's hear it for Professor Yackee and Burden.
You have been watching a production of Wisconsin Eye, your unfiltered window into legislative deliberations and public policy programming, where our mission is to provide Wisconsinites an opportunity to access the legislative process and connect with conversations that inform our citizenry. Please consider supporting our mission, and thank you for watching. Wisconsin Eye, policy made public.